Number 1. Brittni Colleps. She seemed like the kind of teacher every student remembered fondly. Young, energetic, and approachable, Brittni Colleps had a way of making her classroom feel less intimidating and more personal. But in 2011, the private life of this Texas high school teacher would erupt into a scandal that shocked her community and quickly made headlines across the nation. What began as admiration for a trusted teacher turned into one of the most talked about cases of inappropriate student-teacher relationships in recent history. Brittni Colleps was, by all appearances, living a stable and ordinary life. She was married, a mother of 3 children, and had served in the military before turning to education. Those who knew her described her as responsible and caring, someone balancing the demands of family and career. On paper, she was a role model. She taught at Kennedale High School, a suburban school near Fort Worth, Texas, where she had been hired just a few years earlier. For parents, entrusting their children to her classroom seemed like a safe choice. No one could have predicted the headlines that would soon follow. The story began to unravel in the spring of 2011. Behind closed doors, Brittni Colleps had begun engaging in sexual relationships with multiple male students, all of them over the age of 18. These encounters reportedly took place at her home while her family was away. What made the case stand out was not only that the relationships were between a teacher and her students, but also the number of individuals involved. Investigators would later reveal that at least 5 male students had been part of these encounters, a fact that amplified the case's notoriety once it became public. The truth came out in a way that might sound almost inevitable in the modern age. Rumors circulated among students, and word eventually reached school administrators. From there, authorities were notified. Once police began investigating, the students involved came forward, confirming the relationships. Cell phone evidence and explicit exchanges further supported their accounts. For the community of Kennedale, the revelations hit like a lightning bolt. A teacher who had been trusted to guide and educate students was now accused of violating one of the most important boundaries in education. Prosecutors built their case carefully. Under Texas law, it did not matter that the students were legally adults. State statutes clearly prohibit sexual relationships between teachers and students enrolled in their school, regardless of age. The law exists to recognize the inherent imbalance of power between an educator and their students. This meant that the central facts were not in dispute. The students' ages did not absolve Colleps of responsibility. Her defense team argued that the relationships were consensual, but in the eyes of the law, the question was never about consent. It was about professional boundaries, duty of care, and the misuse of authority. When the case went to trial in 2012, the details shocked audiences both in the courtroom and across the country. Media coverage was intense, focusing on the number of students involved and the circumstances of the encounters. Testimony from the students painted a picture of how quickly things escalated once boundaries were crossed. The jury listened as the prosecution laid out its case. A teacher had abused her position, betraying the trust of both her students and their families. The verdict was clear. In May 2012, Brittni Colleps was convicted on 16 counts of having improper relationships with students. When it came time for sentencing, the stakes were high. The prosecution asked the jury to send a message about accountability and the protection of students. The jury ultimately sentenced Colleps to 5 years in prison. For some, this seemed lenient considering the number of counts, while for others, it was seen as an appropriately measured response given that the students were legally adults. Colleps began serving her sentence shortly after the trial concluded. She would spend approximately half of her 5-year term behind bars before being released in 2016. After her release, she largely withdrew from the public eye, leaving behind the kind of media attention that few people could ever fully escape. Her case remained one of the more infamous examples in Texas of how the law treats inappropriate relationships between teachers and students, even when age is not a factor. The fallout from the case extended far beyond Colleps herself. The Kennedale community faced intense scrutiny, with parents questioning how such behavior could have gone unnoticed for so long. The case sparked debates in Texas and across the country about the boundaries between teachers and students, the importance of maintaining professional ethics, and the consequences when those boundaries are crossed. For educators, the case became a cautionary tale. For parents, it was a chilling reminder that trust in authority figures is never absolute. Reflecting on the story of Brittni Colleps raises difficult questions. How does someone go from a respected teacher and military veteran to the center of a criminal trial? Was it poor judgment, a sense of invincibility, or something deeper about the pressures in her personal life? The answers may never be fully clear, but the impact is undeniable. What began as a scandal in one Texas high school turned into a national conversation about responsibility, boundaries, and the consequences of breaking trust. Number 2, Mary Kay Letourneau. In the mid-1990s, the story of Mary Kay Letourneau stunned the nation in a way few cases ever had. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a wife, a mother of 4, and a respected member of her Seattle area community. Yet her name became synonymous with one of the most notorious teacher-student scandals in American history. What made it so shocking was not just the relationship itself, but the ages involved, the repeated violations of court orders, and the fact that, years later, it would evolve into something few could have imagined. Mary Kay Letourneau was born in 1962 into a large Catholic family with political connections. Her father had been a state legislator, and her upbringing was one of discipline and traditional values. She attended Arizona State University, where she met and married her husband, Steve Letourneau. Together, they had 4 children and eventually settled in the Seattle area. By the early 1990s, Mary Kay had built a reputation as a dedicated elementary school teacher. Parents saw her as nurturing, engaging, and invested in her students' success. But behind that image, cracks in her personal life were beginning to form. Her marriage was troubled, marked by allegations of infidelity and emotional distance. It was in this environment that Mary Kay met 12-year-old Vili Fualau, one of her students. What began as mentoring and encouragement would turn into something far more troubling. By 1996, the two were engaged in an inappropriate sexual relationship that, by Washington state law, constituted statutory rape. The fact that Mary Kay was 34 years old and Vili was only 12 turned the case into one of the most sensational in recent history. In March 1997, Letourneau gave birth to a daughter fathered by Vili. That same year, she was arrested and charged with 2 counts of second-degree child rape. The legal system initially showed an unusual degree of leniency. In August 1997, Letourneau reached a plea agreement that reduced her potential prison time significantly. She was sentenced to 6 months in county jail, with 3 months suspended and ordered to undergo treatment. A crucial part of the deal was a no-contact order with Vili, but soon after her release, she violated that order. In February 1998, police discovered Letourneau and Fualau together in a car. At the time, she was pregnant again with his second child. The violation of the no-contact order had major consequences. The plea deal was revoked, and she was ordered to serve her full original sentence of 7.5 years in prison. In October 1998, she gave birth to her second daughter while incarcerated. The situation was extraordinary. A school teacher serving prison time for her relationship with a former student, now raising children born of that very relationship. Mary Kay served her full sentence, eventually being released in August 2004. What followed was perhaps the most controversial chapter in the entire saga. Within a year of her release, she and Vili Fualau, by then an adult, reunited publicly. Despite the history, despite the years of legal battles and media scrutiny, the two insisted that their relationship was genuine. In 2005, they married in a highly publicized ceremony, attended by hundreds and covered extensively by the press. The marriage drew widespread criticism, with many questioning how a relationship that began under such circumstances could ever be viewed as legitimate. Yet for years, they lived as a married couple, raising their 2 daughters together. The public fallout of the case was immense. In the late 1990s, Letourneau's story dominated tabloids, talk shows, and nightly news broadcasts. The combination of her role as a trusted teacher, the extreme age gap, and the defiance of court orders made it one of the most infamous scandals of its era. It also sparked a broader debate about how society perceives female offenders in cases of sexual misconduct with minors. Some argued that the media treated Letourneau more sympathetically than it would have treated a male teacher in a similar case. Others saw the coverage as appropriately critical, pointing to the damage caused not only to her students, but also to her own family, including her 4 older children from her marriage. Over time, the relationship between Letourneau and Fualau remained a point of fascination. They gave interviews, appeared in television specials, and continued to attract attention even as they attempted to live a more private life. For many, the image of a teacher marrying her former student, whose relationship had begun when he was a child, was impossible to reconcile. In 2017, Fualau filed for legal separation, though later statements suggested their relationship had been complicated but ongoing in some form. Mary Kay Letourneau's life came to an end in 2020 when she died of cancer at the age of 58. Vili Fualau and their daughters were by her side. Her death closed one of the most polarizing chapters in American true crime history. To some, her story was a cautionary tale of boundaries broken and trust betrayed. To others, it was a disturbing example of how the legal system handled a case that blurred the line between crime and personal relationships. Reflecting on the Letourneau case leaves behind many questions that still linger today. How could a trusted teacher cross such a profound boundary? How did the justice system balance punishment with the complexities of a relationship that continued for decades? And what impact did it leave on the children caught in the middle? For those who followed the story from beginning to end, Mary Kay Letourneau remains a name that evokes both shock and debate, an unsettling reminder of the consequences when authority and trust are violated in the most intimate way. Number 3. Pamela Rogers Turner. In 2005, a Tennessee school teacher went from respected educator to national headline in a matter of days. Her name was Pamela Rogers Turner, and her case became one of the most talked about teacher scandals of its time. What began as whispers in a small-town gymnasium spiraled into repeated courtroom drama, multiple prison sentences, and a story that refused to fade because of her inability or refusal to stop. Pamela Rogers Turner was born and raised in Tennessee, where she built a career in education and athletics. She was well liked for her upbeat personality, her enthusiasm for sports, and her connection with students as a physical education teacher. Married to a local coach, she appeared to have the kind of stable life many admired: a respected job, a supportive spouse, and a trusted role in her community. But behind the surface, she began crossing boundaries that would ultimately destroy her career and freedom. In early 2005, rumors spread among students and parents in McMinnville, Tennessee. The concern suggested that Pamela had developed an inappropriate relationship with a 13-year-old student. Investigators later confirmed these suspicions, uncovering evidence of misconduct, including digital messages and encounters that crossed professional lines. For the community, the revelations were devastating. A trusted teacher had violated the role of responsibility she was entrusted with. The investigation moved quickly. Prosecutors charged her with more than 24 counts, including exploitation and abuse of authority. The seriousness of the charges reflected the fact that the student was just 13 years old. In August 2005, Pamela pleaded no contest to 4 counts and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But this was not the end. Despite receiving an 8-year term, she served only 9 months before being released on probation with strict conditions, including having no contact with the student. Yet within a year, Pamela was arrested again for breaking those very terms. Her repeated violations of probation ensured that her case would continue to appear in headlines long after her original conviction, making her one of the most infamous examples of a teacher whose misconduct led to multiple prison terms. Authorities discovered that Turner had been sending explicit text messages, videos, and photographs to the same student she had originally been ordered to avoid. The violations were serious and undeniable. The court responded with far less leniency this time. She was sentenced to an additional 7 years in prison for breaking her probation and continuing the illegal contact. This second fall from grace made her case stand out nationally, as it underscored a troubling pattern. A convicted teacher who not only broke the law, but seemed unwilling to stop even after facing serious consequences. Pamela served her second prison sentence until her release in 2012. By then, she had spent much of her 30s behind bars, her teaching career permanently destroyed, her marriage ended, and her reputation irreparably damaged. While many teacher-student cases fade from the public eye after sentencing, Turner's repeated arrests kept her name alive in media discussions about teacher misconduct. News outlets revisited her story as an example of how probation violations can lead to even harsher punishment, and how repeat offenses erode public trust in the justice system's ability to deter. The fallout extended well beyond Pamela herself. For her community, the case was a black mark on the local school system. Parents expressed outrage that a trusted teacher had abused her authority in such a blatant way, and her repeated defiance of court orders only deepened the frustration. Nationally, her story became part of a wave of media coverage in the mid-2000s focusing on female teachers convicted of misconduct with their students. It fueled a broader cultural conversation about gender and crime, with some questioning whether female offenders received the same scrutiny as their male counterparts. In reflecting on Pamela Rogers Turner's story, one is left with a picture of repeated opportunities squandered. She had the chance to build a respected career as an educator, the chance to rebuild her life after her first conviction, and the chance to obey court orders that were designed to protect both her and her victim. Each time, she chose a path that led her deeper into scandal and prison. By the time of her release in 2012, she was no longer just a teacher who had broken the law once. She had become a symbol of what happens when boundaries are ignored and second chances are thrown away. Pamela's case continues to stand out because it asks a difficult question. Why would someone risk everything, even after facing consequences the first time? Was it recklessness, denial, or something deeper about her inability to let go? Whatever the answer, her story remains a sobering reminder of the importance of boundaries in education, the impact of repeated misconduct, and the lasting consequences of choices that can never be undone. Number 4. Debra Lafave. When news of Debra Lafave's arrest broke in 2004, the story spread nationwide almost instantly. A Florida middle school teacher accused of misconduct with a 14-year-old student, already a shocking headline, drew even more attention because of who she was. Young, blonde, and conventionally attractive, Lafave's case became one of the most widely discussed teacher scandals of its time. The mix of crime, notoriety, and courtroom drama made her name a fixture in news coverage and sparked heated debates about justice, punishment, and gender bias in the legal system. Debra Lafave was born in Riverview, Florida, in 1980. Growing up, she was seen as outgoing and ambitious, someone who seemed destined for success. After high school, she earned a degree in education and later married a police officer. By her early 20s, she appeared to have it all: a teaching position in Tampa, a stable marriage, and the admiration of students who viewed her as approachable and charismatic. On the surface, she looked like the image of a dedicated teacher with a bright future. But beneath that image, her life was becoming more unstable. By 2004, her marriage was strained, and she was facing personal challenges. It was during this time that Lafave engaged in conduct with a student that crossed professional boundaries and ultimately destroyed her career. Investigators later confirmed the inappropriate relationship, which came to light after the boy confided in his mother, who immediately alerted authorities. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Police quickly gathered evidence, including testimony from the victim and statements from others who had noticed concerning behavior. Lafave was arrested in June 2004 and charged with multiple felonies under Florida law. The fact that she was married to a law enforcement officer only deepened the sense of betrayal felt by many in the community. Prosecutors prepared for what appeared to be an inevitable prison sentence. As the case unfolded, the public response was sharply divided. Many were outraged that a trusted teacher had violated the responsibility of her position. Others noted how the media focused on Lafave's appearance, often overshadowing the seriousness of the charges. This raised difficult questions. Would the case have been handled the same if she didn't fit a particular image? Would sentencing have looked different if the teacher had been male? These debates fueled national discussion about fairness in both media portrayal and the justice system, making the Debra Lafave case one of the most controversial of its era. In 2005, Lafave reached a plea agreement that stunned much of the public. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of lewd or lascivious battery and, instead of prison, received 3 years of house arrest, followed by 7 years of probation. The plea deal was justified by prosecutors in part to spare the victim the trauma of testifying at trial. Yet many observers felt the sentence was disproportionately light, especially given the serious nature of the charges. For some, it seemed to confirm suspicions that gender and appearance had influenced the outcome. But the story didn't end there. In the years that followed, Lafave struggled to comply with the terms of her probation. In 2011, she was accused of violating its conditions after having contact with a 17-year-old coworker at her job, an interaction that was deemed a breach of the no-contact rules. This violation led to her probation being revoked, and she served a brief term in county jail. By the time she was released, her teaching license had long been revoked, her marriage had ended, and her once promising future was gone. The notoriety of the case extended well beyond Florida. National outlets from CNN to People magazine ran stories about her, and her name became shorthand in discussions about teacher misconduct. The debate over whether her sentence had been too lenient continued for years. For some, her case symbolized the need for stricter and more consistent sentencing guidelines in cases involving authority figures and minors. For others, it was a reminder of how media portrayal can shape public perception and even courtroom outcomes. After her release, Debra Lafave largely withdrew from public life. She has occasionally been the subject of follow-up reports, but she has avoided interviews and appearances, choosing instead to live quietly. Despite her attempts to stay out of the spotlight, her name remains linked to the mid-2000s wave of teacher scandals that dominated headlines, a wave that permanently altered public trust in schools and the individuals entrusted to teach children. Reflecting on her story today, the questions raised by Lafave's case still feel unresolved. How should the justice system balance compassion for victims with appropriate punishment for offenders? Did public fascination with her appearance cloud the way her actions were judged? And what lasting lessons can schools, parents, and communities draw from cases like hers? Whatever the answers, the name Debra Lafave remains etched in the public consciousness as a symbol of boundaries crossed, trust broken, and debates that extend far beyond one Florida classroom. Number 5. Brianne Altice. In 2014, the quiet suburbs of Utah were rattled by a case that captured national attention. Brianne Altice, a high school English teacher, was arrested and accused of misconduct involving multiple students. What made the story especially shocking was not only the number of individuals involved, but also her decision to continue one of those relationships even after being released on bail. The case of Brianne Altice became a cautionary tale about boundaries, trust, and the consequences of crossing the line between teacher and student. Altice had been a respected educator at Davis High School, just north of Salt Lake City. Born in 1979, she had built a reputation as personable, stylish, and approachable. Students often described her as someone who connected easily with them, breaking down the barriers that can exist between young people and authority figures. On the surface, she appeared to have it all: a career in education, admiration from her students, and a future filled with promise. But behind the classroom doors, she was making choices that would end her career and ultimately lead to prison. The first signs of trouble appeared in 2013, when rumors began spreading that Altice was blurring professional boundaries. Those suspicions gained weight when 3 students came forward with information that later became part of a criminal investigation. Because they were under her direct supervision, Utah law classified her actions as felony offenses, reflecting the imbalance of power between a teacher and her pupils. Altice was arrested in January 2014, and the details outlined in the charging documents shocked the community. Prosecutors alleged that she had engaged in repeated misconduct with 3 students. Parents were outraged. The Davis School District immediately placed her on leave, and the trust families placed in the school system was shaken. The legal process was complex. Altice faced multiple felony counts that could have carried decades in prison if she had been convicted on all charges. But the case escalated further when it was discovered that, despite strict conditions of release, she had remained in contact with one of the students while awaiting trial. That decision resulted in new charges being filed in 2014 and reinforced the perception that she was unwilling or unable to comply with court orders. By 2015, Altice accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts connected to her misconduct. While the agreement reduced the number of charges, it still carried a significant penalty. In July 2015, she was sentenced to a term of 2 to 30 years in prison under Utah's indeterminate sentencing system. This meant the parole board would ultimately decide how long she remained behind bars, depending on their evaluation of her rehabilitation and readiness for release. Altice began serving her sentence at the Utah State Prison, and for a time, it seemed her case had reached its conclusion. But her name continued to surface in news reports, partly because of the community's outrage, and partly because of the ongoing debate about how the justice system should handle female offenders in cases like hers. The fact that she had been a trusted teacher at a well-regarded high school made her story resonate far beyond Utah. In 2019, after serving just over 4 years of her sentence, Altice appeared before the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. During her hearings, she expressed remorse for her actions, acknowledging the damage she had caused to her victims, their families, and the community. The board ultimately granted her parole, and she was released later that year. Her early release reignited conversations about sentencing, rehabilitation, and whether justice had truly been served. The public fallout from Altice's case was severe. Parents questioned how such relationships could go undetected for so long, and students who had once admired her struggled to reconcile the teacher they knew with the headlines they read. Nationally, her case was featured in discussions about teacher misconduct, joining a string of high-profile examples that underscored the importance of strict professional boundaries in education. Many pointed out the recurring theme of gender bias in how cases like hers were perceived. While some in the media framed her as troubled or misguided, others stressed that her victims were still minors who had been taken advantage of by someone in a position of power. Looking back, the story of Brianne Altice remains unsettling. She was a teacher who once inspired her students, only to betray that trust in a way that left lasting scars. Her choices led to a prison sentence, the loss of her career, and a public reputation that will never fully fade. At the same time, her early parole and attempts to rebuild her life raise lingering questions about justice, redemption, and whether rehabilitation is possible after such profound violations of trust. Her case forces us to confront difficult questions. How can schools better detect and prevent misconduct before it escalates? How should the justice system balance punishment with rehabilitation in cases where authority figures cross the line? And perhaps most hauntingly, how many lives are changed forever when trust in a teacher is shattered? For the community of Davis County, and for those who followed the story nationwide, Brianne Altice's case remains a stark reminder of just how much is at stake when boundaries are ignored. Number 6. Kathryn Ronk. In 2015, a private Catholic high school in Michigan was thrust into the spotlight when one of its teachers was accused of betraying the very students she was hired to guide. Her name was Kathryn Ronk, a Spanish teacher at Bishop Foley High School in Madison Heights. What followed was a scandal that not only shocked her community, but also sparked a broader conversation about accountability, fairness in sentencing, and the responsibilities educators hold in positions of trust. Ronk had seemed to embody the qualities of an ideal teacher. In her early 30s at the time, she was well-educated, enthusiastic about her subject, and fluent in Spanish. Students often described her as approachable and engaging in the classroom, the kind of teacher who made learning more relatable. For parents sending their children to a respected private Catholic school, there was an assumption that both the academics and the environment would reflect discipline, safety, and faith-based values. Few could have imagined that one of the faculty members would cross one of the most serious boundaries in education. The case began with troubling revelations in 2014. Authorities determined that Ronk had engaged in misconduct involving a 15-year-old male student. Investigators later confirmed that these incidents had occurred inside the very classrooms where she was supposed to be teaching. The fact that the setting was a religious school only heightened the sense of betrayal for families who had placed their trust in both the institution and its staff. When the details became public, the case quickly gained statewide and even national attention. The Oakland County Sheriff's Office led the investigation, and prosecutors moved swiftly to bring charges. Ronk was arrested and charged with multiple counts of third-degree criminal sexual conduct. Under Michigan law, the fact that the victim was 15 made the charges especially serious, and the power imbalance between a teacher and a student left no room for ambiguity. As the case moved toward trial, Ronk chose to plead guilty in 2015 to one count of third-degree criminal sexual conduct. Her guilty plea meant she accepted responsibility for what had taken place, but it did not lessen the gravity of her situation. During her sentencing hearing, the court was presented with a unique challenge: how to determine a punishment that balanced her acceptance of guilt, the harm caused to the victim, and the broader message to the community. The defense argued for leniency, citing Ronk's lack of criminal history and her willingness to admit fault. But the prosecution stressed that the seriousness of the crime demanded accountability, regardless of her background. The presiding judge, Nancy Grant, made headlines during the hearing by explicitly rejecting the idea that gender should play any role in sentencing. Judge Grant noted that if the roles were reversed, if a male teacher had engaged in misconduct with a female student, society would not hesitate to demand significant prison time. In this case, she insisted, the law would be applied the same way. In June 2015, Kathryn Ronk was sentenced to 6 to 15 years in prison. The sentence was viewed as firm and unflinching, particularly in comparison to some other cases around the country where female teachers received probation or lighter punishments. For many, it was a landmark moment, underscoring the principle that crimes involving authority figures and students should be treated with equal seriousness, no matter the gender of the offender. Ronk began serving her sentence in the Michigan Department of Corrections, and the story continued to resonate long after the courtroom proceedings had ended. For the Bishop Foley community, the case was devastating. The school, which prided itself on its Catholic identity and close-knit culture, was left to grapple with the damage to its reputation and the breach of trust parents felt. The victim and his family were forced to deal with the personal consequences of the scandal, while classmates and alumni expressed disbelief that something so serious had taken place within their school walls. Nationally, Ronk's case was often cited in discussions about gender bias in sentencing. For years, critics had argued that female teachers who engaged in misconduct with male students sometimes received more lenient punishments than male teachers in similar circumstances. Ronk's 6 to 15-year sentence became a counterexample, showing a court determined to avoid that perception. The judge's remarks during sentencing were quoted widely, reinforcing the principle that justice should be blind to gender and focused instead on the facts of the case. As the years passed, Ronk's story faded somewhat from headlines, but remained a reference point in debates about professional ethics, education, and criminal justice. Her sentence placed her in prison well into the following decade, with parole eligibility only after serving the minimum term. Her career as a teacher was over, and her name became permanently tied to one of the most infamous teacher-student scandals in Michigan's history. Reflecting on the case of Kathryn Ronk leaves behind a mixture of lessons and lingering questions. What drives a teacher, entrusted with shaping young minds, to cross a line so stark and damaging? How should communities rebuild trust when those in positions of authority betray it? And perhaps most significantly, what does equal justice truly look like when applied to cases that capture national attention? For Bishop Foley High School, and for many who followed the story, Ronk's conviction was more than just one person's downfall. It was a statement that no matter who you are, some boundaries can never be crossed without profound and lasting consequences. Number 7. Nicole Dufault. In 2014, the community of Maplewood, New Jersey, was stunned by the arrest of Nicole Dufault, a language arts teacher at Columbia High School. What emerged was a case involving multiple students that quickly became one of the state's most high-profile teacher scandals. Dufault, then 35, was known as personable and approachable. Colleagues described her as dedicated, and parents trusted her with their children's education. She was also a mother of 2, balancing work and home life. But investigators uncovered a disturbing pattern that shattered her reputation and the trust families had placed in her. Prosecutors revealed that between 2013 and 2014, she engaged in misconduct with 6 male students, most of them in the early years of high school. Some of the incidents happened off campus, while others took place at or near the school itself. The discovery left parents horrified. A trusted teacher had abused her authority in the very place students were meant to feel safe. The investigation began after concerns were raised about her behavior. Detectives gathered statements from the students involved, confirming this was not an isolated lapse, but repeated misconduct. In September 2014, Dufault was arrested and charged with multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct and endangering the welfare of children. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Parents expressed anger and disbelief, demanding to know how such behavior could have gone unnoticed. The case quickly spread beyond New Jersey, making national headlines and sparking debate about school oversight and accountability. As the case moved forward, prosecutors emphasized that this was not poor judgment, but a serious abuse of trust. Teachers occupy positions of authority, and the law recognizes the imbalance when that power is misused. In 2018, Nicole Dufault pleaded guilty to charges involving two of the boys and was sentenced to 15 years in prison, eligible for parole after serving at least 12. Her story became another reminder of how a single educator's actions can devastate lives, careers, and communities. By 2018, after years of legal proceedings, Nicole Dufault chose to plead guilty. Her decision spared the victims from having to testify in court, but it also meant admitting responsibility for her actions. In 2019, she was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Under the terms of New Jersey's sentencing laws, she would be required to serve most of that time before becoming eligible for parole, roughly 12 years. The sentence was significant, both for its length and for what it represented. Prosecutors had argued that her case required a strong response, given the number of victims and the repeated nature of the conduct. The judge agreed, emphasizing that accountability was essential in order to protect students and uphold public trust in schools. The fallout for the community was far-reaching. Columbia High School, long respected for its academics, now faced questions about how such misconduct could happen on campus. Parents expressed outrage, while students wrestled with the shock of realizing a teacher they knew had been leading a double life. Nationally, the case became part of a larger discussion about the role of gender in teacher misconduct cases. Critics argued that female offenders were sometimes treated more leniently than men. But Dufault's 15-year sentence was seen by many as evidence that courts were willing to hand down firm punishments regardless of gender. Inside prison, Dufault's life changed completely. Her teaching license was revoked, her reputation destroyed, and her two young sons were left to grow up without her presence. While she expressed remorse during her hearings, the consequences of her actions extended far beyond her own life. The students she had harmed were left to process their experiences while navigating the pressures of adolescence and high school. Looking back, the story of Nicole Dufault serves as a sobering reminder of the responsibilities that come with being a teacher. Educators are expected not only to instruct, but to serve as role models, guiding students at a formative stage in their lives. When that trust is violated, the damage ripples outward to the victims, their families, the school, and the broader community. Her case also raises broader questions about prevention. How can schools detect inappropriate behavior sooner? What safeguards can be put in place to ensure students feel safe coming forward? And how should the justice system balance punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation in cases where trust has been so severely broken? For Maplewood, the scandal left scars that will not easily fade. For the nation, it became part of a troubling pattern of teacher misconduct cases that force uncomfortable but necessary conversations about oversight and accountability. And for Nicole Dufault, the consequences were clear: a lengthy prison sentence, the loss of her career, and the permanent stain of a name now linked with one of New Jersey's most notorious teacher scandals. Number 8. Brittany Zamora. In 2019, Arizona became the focus of one of the most widely covered teacher cases in the nation. At the center was Brittany Zamora, a sixth-grade teacher whose name became tied to broken trust and shocking headlines. What made the case stand out was not only the seriousness of the charges, but also the severity of her sentence: 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Born in 1991, Zamora built the image of a successful young educator. After earning her teaching degree, she joined Las Brisas Academy in Goodyear, a suburb of Phoenix. Married to her longtime partner, she seemed to have both a stable personal life and a promising career. Colleagues and parents described her as enthusiastic and committed to making learning enjoyable for children. That image collapsed in 2018 when concerns arose about her interactions with a student. Investigators later determined that her behavior had gone far beyond professional boundaries. Some of the incidents even took place during school hours and inside her classroom, a detail that left parents and administrators stunned. The discovery came after parents noticed troubling signs and school officials were alerted. Police launched an investigation and uncovered digital communications that confirmed the misconduct. The revelations horrified the community and quickly transformed a local school scandal into a national story. In March 2018, Zamora was arrested and charged with multiple felony counts. The case was treated with utmost seriousness because of the clear abuse of authority and the betrayal of her role as a trusted educator. From the beginning, prosecutors signaled that they would seek a lengthy prison sentence. For families in the district, the arrest was devastating. Someone entrusted with guiding children had instead violated that responsibility in the worst possible way. In 2019, Zamora pleaded guilty and received a 20-year prison sentence. For many, the outcome underscored how severely the justice system responds when authority figures abuse their power, and it served as a lasting warning about the responsibilities tied to the profession of teaching. In 2019, Zamora accepted a plea deal rather than face trial on dozens of separate charges. She pleaded guilty to sexual conduct with a minor and related offenses, a decision that ensured she would serve a lengthy prison term. During her sentencing, the judge noted the seriousness of her crimes and the need to protect children from harm. Zamora was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed under her plea agreement, with no chance of parole. That sentence guaranteed she would spend much of her adult life behind bars. The outcome made national headlines, not only because of the length of the sentence, but also because it was seen as one of the harshest punishments ever given to a female teacher in a case of this kind. Supporters of the ruling argued that it sent a clear message. No matter the gender of the offender, the abuse of trust between a teacher and student would be met with serious consequences. Critics, however, questioned why the case had received such sensationalized media attention compared to others. The impact on the community of Goodyear was long-lasting. Parents spoke of broken trust. Students struggled with the attention suddenly focused on their school, and administrators were left dealing with the fallout of a scandal that had placed them under national scrutiny. For many families, the case served as a sobering reminder that vigilance is necessary even in environments that are meant to feel safe. In prison, Zamora's life changed completely. The young woman who had once been celebrated as an energetic teacher was now serving a sentence that will keep her incarcerated until she is middle-aged. Her marriage ended, her teaching license was permanently revoked, and her future outside of prison became limited to whatever life she can rebuild decades later. For the victim and his family, the case left lasting consequences that cannot be undone by any court ruling. The broader public reaction to the case highlighted ongoing debates about teacher misconduct. Some pointed to disparities in sentencing between male and female offenders, while others emphasized the importance of setting an example that protects students regardless of circumstances. Zamora's 20-year sentence became a benchmark, one often cited in discussions about how the justice system handles cases involving authority figures in schools. Reflecting on Brittany Zamora's story raises questions that reach far beyond one Arizona classroom. How could someone with a promising career and a supportive community throw it all away in such a reckless manner? What more can schools and parents do to spot warning signs before situations escalate? And how should justice balance punishment, protection, and prevention in cases that strike so deeply at the trust society places in educators? For the people of Goodyear, the scars of the case remain. For the nation, Zamora's conviction stands as a cautionary tale about the immense responsibility that comes with being a teacher. And for Brittany Zamora herself, the consequences are a reminder that once certain boundaries are broken, the price is not only career and reputation, but decades of freedom. Number 9. Jacqueline Ma. In 2025, one of the most jarring teacher scandals in recent memory came out of San Diego, California. Jacqueline Ma, a highly respected elementary school teacher who had been celebrated as the district's Teacher of the Year in 2022, stood before a judge facing charges that stunned the community. What made the story so shocking was not only the nature of her crimes, but also the contrast between her public image as an award-winning educator and the reality of her conduct behind closed doors. Ma had seemed to embody everything parents and administrators hoped for in a teacher. She worked at Lincoln Acres Elementary in the National School District, where she earned praise for her dedication, her creative approach to teaching, and her ability to connect with young students. Colleagues admired her passion, while parents trusted her completely. In 2022, she was honored as the county's Teacher of the Year, a recognition that further elevated her standing as an outstanding role model. For a time, she was seen as the kind of educator who inspired confidence and pride in the profession. But in 2023, that image began to collapse. Law enforcement received information suggesting that Ma was behaving in ways no teacher ever should with her students. Investigators soon uncovered evidence that she had been cultivating inappropriate relationships with children under her supervision, using manipulation and secrecy to maintain control. 2 former students, aged 11 and 12, were identified as victims. Alongside these findings, authorities also discovered illegal materials in her possession. The news broke quickly, and what had once been a story of a teacher's success transformed into one of deep betrayal. Her arrest sent shockwaves through San Diego. Parents who had trusted her with their children felt devastated, struggling to reconcile the respected Teacher of the Year with the disturbing allegations. Colleagues expressed disbelief, and the broader public followed the case with a mixture of outrage and sorrow. The fact that Ma had used her trusted role to target vulnerable children made the case especially painful for the community. The legal proceedings against her moved swiftly, given the strength of the evidence. Prosecutors emphasized that Ma had abused her authority in one of the most severe ways possible, and they argued that her actions demonstrated a pattern of manipulation designed to exploit her students' trust. Defense attorneys pointed to her lack of prior criminal history, but these arguments carried little weight against the seriousness of the charges. In 2025, Ma pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child sexual abuse and possession of exploitative material. Her guilty plea meant that a full trial was avoided, but it also confirmed the scope of her actions. During sentencing, prosecutors urged the court to impose a lengthy punishment, stressing the importance of deterrence and the lifelong impact on the children involved. The judge agreed, sentencing Jacqueline Ma to a term of 30 years to life in prison. It was one of the harshest penalties ever given to a teacher in the state of California. The severity of the sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the position of trust she had held. As a teacher, she was not only responsible for her students' education, but also for their safety and well-being. By violating that responsibility, she had undermined the very foundation of the school community. The ruling made clear that the justice system would respond firmly to cases where authority figures exploited the vulnerable. The fallout extended far beyond Ma herself. The National School District had to confront the damage to its reputation, as well as the trauma inflicted on students and families. Parents began demanding stronger safeguards and better oversight to ensure that something like this could never happen again. Educators across the state felt the ripple effects as the case renewed discussions about accountability, background checks, and the need for vigilance within schools. Nationally, the case was widely reported because of Ma's prior accolades. The contrast between her image as an award-winning teacher and her eventual conviction highlighted how appearances can be deceiving. The media coverage sparked conversations about grooming behaviors, the subtle tactics used to build inappropriate relationships, and the responsibility of adults to recognize warning signs before it is too late. Inside prison, Ma's once promising career and celebrated public image vanished completely. Her awards were stripped away, her teaching license was revoked, and her name became associated with betrayal rather than inspiration. For the victims and their families, however, the scars of the case remain, raising difficult questions about healing and justice that no sentence can ever fully resolve. Looking back, the story of Jacqueline Ma is one of the starkest examples of how trust can be shattered in education. She had been honored as a shining star among teachers, a professional held up as the very best of her field. Yet behind that honor, she was secretly committing acts that would ruin her career, devastate families, and leave her spending decades in prison. Her case forces us to reflect on the larger issues at play. How can communities protect children more effectively from those who misuse positions of authority? What warning signs might have been missed, and how can schools ensure they are never overlooked again? And perhaps most hauntingly, how could someone so publicly celebrated as a role model have been capable of such profound betrayal? For San Diego, the story of Jacqueline Ma remains a painful reminder that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. For the nation, her conviction underscores the need for vigilance and accountability in education. And for Ma herself, the reality is stark. From Teacher of the Year to a sentence of 30 years to life, her name will forever be tied not to inspiration, but to one of the most shocking falls from grace in modern education. Number 10. Alissa McCommon. In 2024, a small Tennessee town was thrust into the national spotlight after the arrest of Alissa McCommon, a fourth-grade teacher whose misconduct shocked even experienced investigators. What began as quiet suspicions quickly unraveled into one of the most serious teacher cases in recent memory, both for the number of students involved and the outcome in court. McCommon had been teaching in the Covington School District since 2011. In her late 30s, married and a mother herself, she maintained the image of a dedicated educator. Parents trusted her, colleagues worked beside her without suspicion, and for more than a decade she appeared to be an ordinary part of the local school system. But behind that image, investigators would later uncover a pattern of behavior that devastated her community. The case came to light in 2023 after authorities received a tip about concerning conduct. As the investigation unfolded, multiple students came forward with accounts that revealed a long-running abuse of trust. Detectives eventually identified as many as 21 potential victims, with ages ranging from early teens to late high school. For law enforcement, the scope of the allegations was unlike anything they had seen in the district. The seriousness of the case deepened when investigators confirmed that McCommon had given birth to a child connected to one of the students. This detail underscored the long-term consequences of her actions and set her case apart from many others, showing the profound harm caused when a teacher exploits their position. By the time she was arrested, McCommon faced dozens of felony counts. The charges reflected not only the number of victims, but also the repeated misuse of her authority as an educator. For parents across Tipton County, the revelations were devastating, leaving them to question how such behavior could go unchecked for so many years. In 2024, McCommon pleaded guilty to multiple charges. Her plea spared the students from testifying at trial, but confirmed the scale of her misconduct. At sentencing, prosecutors urged the court to impose one of the harshest penalties possible, citing the pattern of abuse, the betrayal of trust, and the lasting damage done to those who had once Alissa McCommon was sentenced to 25 years in state prison with no chance of parole. It was a sentence that ensured she would spend much of her life behind bars. For the victims and their families, the ruling represented accountability, though it could never erase the harm done. For the broader community, it was a signal that the justice system was prepared to act decisively when teachers betray their role in such a serious way. The fallout was immense. Covington, a small town not accustomed to national media attention, found itself at the center of widespread coverage. News outlets across the country reported on the case, and discussions about teacher misconduct once again filled headlines. Parents demanded reforms, asking how someone could go undetected for so long and what schools could do to better safeguard children. For many, the case underscored the importance of vigilance and the need for open communication between students, parents, and administrators. Nationally, the story of McCommon sparked debates about gender bias in sentencing. In previous cases, critics had argued that female offenders sometimes received lighter punishment than men. But McCommon's 25-year sentence with no parole was one of the harshest ever handed down to a teacher in the United States. Prosecutors themselves emphasized that her punishment was meant to send a message. The abuse of children, regardless of the offender's gender, would be met with severe consequences. For McCommon, the consequences were devastating. She lost her career, her freedom, her family's trust, and the respect of her community. Inside prison, her once respected life as a teacher and mother was replaced by decades of confinement. For the victims, the consequences were even deeper. They were left to carry the weight of experiences that no student should ever endure, and their families were left with scars that would not easily heal. Reflecting on the case of Alissa McCommon leaves us with sobering questions. How can schools identify and stop misconduct earlier? How can communities ensure that boundaries are respected and enforced, even by those in positions of trust? And perhaps most importantly, how do we support victims in their long road toward healing? For Tennessee, the McCommon case will remain a defining example of betrayal within the education system. For the nation, it stands as a reminder that no accolade, appearance, or reputation can shield someone from accountability when they violate the most basic responsibilities of their profession. And for Alissa McCommon herself, the sentence of 25 years without parole guarantees that her name will be remembered not for her time in the classroom, but for one of the darkest scandals in modern education. That's all for today's video. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true crime documentaries, and I'll see you next time.